Thanks, Madam Chair. Here we are 2 years after Harvey, Irma, Maria, and that obviously was followed by severe wildfires in the West. And these things continue ongoing. I think 80% of the members of this committee probably wouldn't be unrepresentative of members of Congress as a whole, perhaps slightly lower, represent districts with active FEMA recovery efforts underway, including a number of counties in my state because of a very extreme and unusual winter weather event last year. I can't recall the last time that FEMA was working on so many costly recoveries simultaneously. Perhaps the Associate Administrator can contradict that and say this is normal, but I'm afraid it's the new normal and not the way things have been historically. The Budget Control Act of 2011 made appropriations for FEMA's Disaster Relief Fund more predictable, and we have put up a large amount of supplemental resources on top of that. We've worked across the aisle. Disasters are not partisan in nature, and we've worked on both sides of the aisle to reform Stafford, cut red tape, the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act, Sandy Recovery Improvement Act, Disaster Recovery Reform Act being the most recent bipartisan efforts. But there's more needs to be done, and that's why we're here today to figure out how can we better administer these programs for recovery, but also what more can we do for resilience, essentially prevention, preventing a loss of life, preventing loss of infrastructure, saving, so we don't further bankrupt the Federal Flood Insurance Fund. And then was mentioned earlier, HUD is now one of the largest providers of post-disaster recovery with the CDBGDRs. I don't know what that means. Anyway, Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program. We put tens of billions of dollars in there. It's preferred because it's seen as something that can be move the money more quickly, but it hasn't quite worked out that way. And just last week, HUD officials told our colleagues on Appropriations Committee that they had no legitimate reason for withholding funds for Puerto Rico, which should have started flowing months ago, but perhaps that echoes foreign aid to the Ukraine. I'm not sure. Well, I'm glad we have testimony for the record from HUD, and they briefed our members. I hope in the future they'll sit at the table alongside their federal partners and share with us future concerns about challenges and hopefully be able to report more successes. Glad the EDA is here. They can provide insight into administering the first tranche of supplemental disaster funding provided in the 18 Bipartisan Budget Act, as well as any steps they're taking differently to approach the second tranche of funds. And as I've noted, FEMA's stretched thin. I fear it's delayed some of these larger recoveries beyond the delays being experienced as a slow CDBGDR process. These disaster-impacted communities in Oregon and elsewhere want nothing more than to recover quickly. Same goes for disaster survivors. And then, of course, the GAO can attest to delays in disaster recovery can be devastating for the economic well-being of the communities. Survivors can't work because they're tangled in red tape of recovery programs and they risk losing their jobs, not being able to provide for their families. If businesses can't open because of workforce challenges or depleted customer bases, Coast Guard just awarded hundreds of millions of dollars to a firm constructing one of their new ships because of those factors. Delays with recovery can spiral out of control, and yet another catastrophe for these communities. So it's vital that each of the departments and agencies tasked with recovery have the resources and expertise to fulfill missions, and for state and local governments to have the capacity and wherewithal to navigate these recovery programs as well. I look forward to hearing today what we can do to further decrease existing red tape, see where improvements can be made, assure that we're leveraging the interests of all parties, we're being more proactive in terms of resilience and getting ahead of these issues, and working between the government, nonprofit, and private sector to get our disaster impacted communities on a quicker path to recovery. With that, Madam Chair, thanks for holding this important hearing.